This is the second in a series of newspaper articles sent to me by a guy from YouTube channel, Dean Hawke. This is what Dean found when he was researching Flat Earth. He went down to his local library and found over 100 articles amongst the microfiche collected there. And this one is from the Hampshire Telegraph, Saturday, March 28th, 1896. Flat Earth Lecture. Noisy scene at Landport. Mr. Ebenezer Breach will be remembered, no doubt, as having delivered some Flat Earth lectures in Portsmouth some time ago. The riot which followed the last one rather put a damper on Mr. Breach, but that gentleman, feeling that the truth must prevail, on Thursday evening mounted the platform again and delivered his fourth lecture at the Albert Hall to a demonstrative audience. Mr. Breach, who appeared on the bills as E.B., writer, poet and author with royal patronage, God Save the Queen, dealt with several subjects, among them being the Earth, Sun, Moon, eclipses, Dr. Nansen at the North Pole, and the measurement of the Sun. When the audience arrived at the hall, they found it already decorated with the apparatus for the lecture, the diagrams and models. Mr. Breach's handiwork was prominent. On one side was a piece of calico, on which was painted in large letters the words, "Know thyself. I am wonderfully and fearfully made." Two maps of the world that looked like bicycle wheels after a collision were there. It afterwards transpired that a shepherd had drawn them. At the back were 3 portraits of noted astronomers. Over these was a long strip of canvas covered with scraps which represented the heavens with halfpenny and penny stars, blood orange planets, and 2 circular saw-like pictures for the sun. But the most wonderful of all were the models. The chief of these was the North Pole, which Mr. Breach had rescued at the last lecture. The only one saved from the wreck. It had I wonder what happened there. It had a new knob on the top, and the Arctic ice, soda, was replaced by wadding, which represented the eternal snows. Round this was a sea of brown paper. A model of the ecliptic Upharsin, made of wooden hoops, was also displayed, while the Union Jack waved over all. The start. Tremendous applause. At 7:30 there was loud applause, and Mr. Breach put his head out of the back door to see what sort of house there was. While the applause grew louder, a man who said he was Bolt of Southsea went round and sold flat earth tracts and argued. At last Mr. Breach emerged with Mr. Turle, the chairman. He was greeted with tremendous applause. By this time the audience, which included several town councillors and a policeman, was pretty numerous. Mr. Breach started by reading scripture and an astronomer's prayer. This over, he went on to speak of the untrue and the true in astronomy. At first the applause was so persistent and deafening that he could not be heard, and the next thing that happened was the advent of a frightful smell. A dastardly outrage. Suddenly, while half the audience were convulsed with laughter, a most offensive odour arose from some chemical substance scattered about the floor in the centre of the hall. This caused a remarkably quick migration, and as it spread, the audience scattered until the disorder was very great indeed. Meanwhile, Mr. Breach had been speaking. He said some people said the Earth was a wandering star and a burning planet. It was not. It wasn't a heavenly body. Loud applause. He directed their attention to one of the planets, which immediately fell off the screen, at which the audience roared. The fearful smell continued, and some of the people went out. Mr. Breach appealed for order, saying they had no idea of the pains required to get up the lecture. Hear, hear. A call for the constable. Then he said the Earth didn't go on the sun's orbit, and someone quiet cried, "Rats!" and blew a deviline, at which Mr. Breach called upon the constable to "Come here!" Loud applause. No orbit, said Mr. Breach, could be necessary for a fixed Earth, and there was a tremendous burst of applause. This was repeated when he said there was no necessity for gravitation, and anything unnecessary did not exist. As to the ecliptic, the earth never was there and never would be. It had no right to be there. Cheers. A solid earth rested on a solid foundation. Laughter and applause. The likenesses were those of Galileo, Copernicus, and Tycho Brahe. Cries of "Shame!" Modern astronomy was so simple that it could really be understood. Tremendous applause and laughter. Touching the spot. Mr. Breach next gave a sermonette and then told a funny story. The disorder got worse and the policeman looked uncomfortable. Mr. Breach explained his diagrams. He said that one of the gilt halfpenny stars was the North Star and pointed it out, whereupon a wag remarked, "Homicea touches the spot." Dr. Nansen was then dealt with and a blackboard was shown with his route marked thereon. The great lob-tore feat. But the treat of the evening was the repetition of the lob-tore feat. This Mr. Breach performed amid loud cheering. Placing the lob-tore on the wire universe which ran round the North Pole, he guided it round with his hand. The audience demanded an encore, and Mr. Breach performed again, saying that one sun did the work for the whole lot. Figures and another encore. Then he went into figures. In the beginning, the stars were served out to all nations. Great laughter. The earth was 30,000 miles long and 10,000 miles broad, and the heavens the same. Laughter. He proposed to measure the sun on the ecliptic, which had never been done before. It was 5,000 miles across. Cheering and deafening laughter. Mr. Breach next repeated the lob-tore experiment with a gilt ball and a cricket ball on the wooden hoop arrangement. This also brought down the house. Once the best ball fell out off the universe, but one of the audience recovered it. The smell again. Then the fiendish smell came on again. Someone suggested that bad eggs had been smashed. Mr. H. Palin looked under a chair and found a capsule, which he handed to Mr. Breach. Mr. Breach gave his views with regard to eclipses and said that 200 years ago, nature shuddered at one, and birds dropped dead. A voice, "Author?" Laughter and applause. At the last eclipse he saw streaks of sunlight on the moon. Cheers. All the heavenly bodies eclipsed each other, more or less. More lecture and singing. Then Mr. Breach described the creation again and said that the ocean was a standing monument to the flood. Shouts and applause. He prophesied that the earth would not last more than about 10 years more. Cheers. And that the audience would come to judgment for their actions that evening. More cheers. The audience sang "Up in a Balloon," cheered again, and sang "For he's a jolly good fellow." Mr. Breach protested against the uproar and said that retribution would fall on the offenders. He would sooner be in his shoes than theirs. Applause. A vote of thanks. The end. This concluded the lecture, and Mr. Breach sat down, at which there was great cheering and cries of "Encore!" Tremendous cheers greeted Mr. Palin when he got onto the platform and asked some questions. The reply was drowned in "For he's a jolly good fellow," and then Kentish fire. Mr. Breach wanted the audience to sing "God Save the Queen" and go, but Mr. Palin proposed a vote of thanks to him for his lucid, cheers, clear, cheers, and elaborate exposition. Cheers. He hoped there would be another Flat Earth lecture. Mr. J. Bishop seconded. Mr. Breach replied and said it would take another 2 years before he gave another lecture. Shame! Most of the audience then went out. Some stayed behind, however, and Mr. Breach threatened to give them in charge of the police if they touched his models. The policeman pulled up the North Pole, and Mr. Breach, grabbing it hurriedly, made his exit by the back way, leaving the policeman to protect the diagrams. Very funny stuff. So you can see there were people trying to disrupt these kind of lectures way back then. I guess these people were bristling against the encroachment of the globe earth theory coming to them, and the ridiculousness, how ridiculous the globe earth would have sounded to people in 1896, especially probably religious people who all knew their Bibles inside and out, but it would have sounded ridiculous to even atheists or non-religious people until we had these NASA so-called photographs that convinces so many people today who haven't looked too closely at them. So thanks again, Dean. That one was a beauty.